Bob Woodward interviewed President Trump 18 times for his book Rage. For more on some of the other takeaways, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Asma Khalid. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter, and Asma is a national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. Welcome to you both. A lot to sift through. Asma, let me start with you. On June 19th, Bob Woodward asked the president about white privilege, and I want to play some of that interview. Let's take a listen.
And do you have any sense that that privilege has isolated and put you in a cave to a certain extent, as it put me and I think lots of white privileged people in a cave, and that we have to work our way out of it to understand the anger and the pain particularly black people feel in this country?
No, you really drank the Kool-Aid, didn't you? Listen to you. Wow. No, I don't feel that at all.
So, Asma, what other comments did the president make on this topic, and what did they suggest about his views of the black community?
You know, he also made some comments when he was asked about the need to understand where black voters are coming from in this moment. I think what's really interesting about some of these comments he made about race is how much they jive with what he has publicly said. I would argue that the coronavirus comments were perhaps the most damning and the most surprising because they give a sense of the doublespeak that we heard from the president. But when it came to race, when it came to issues of white privilege, I would make the argument that much of what he said behind closed doors to Bob Woodward is akin to what we've heard publicly from the president. And none of it was particularly shocking if you followed his trajectory for the last couple of years.
Yeah, it seemed to be consistent with what we have heard publicly. Caitlin, our CBS News 2020 campaign reporter, colleague Adam Brewster, spoke to some of the president's supporters outside his rally today in Freeland, Michigan. He asked one man how he felt about the president's decision to downplay the severity of COVID-19 at the start of the pandemic. Let's go ahead and listen to his response.
I own a business too, and I look at it as if I have to tell my employees to implement some cautions, I would gradually work them into it. It's not like a bomb went off, where you have to exit all the buildings and stuff like that. I think he did a wonderful job of not getting everybody excited and putting them into a frenzy and making it worse off. He's on the right track. He did a good job.
So, Caitlin, what do you make of that response?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the people who tend to go to Trump's rallies are people who are core supporters. And I think the question that we have going into this election is not necessarily whether he can keep and hold on to his base. He's shown that he's able to do that, but whether he can reach out to people that dropped off from the Republican Party, especially in 2018, and not even trying to reach Democrats, but trying to win back Republicans who in the 2018 midterms, especially in the suburbs, said that they were turned off by the president's rhetoric and wanted to send a message by voting for Democrats. So that's where the president's reelection campaign really has to grow. And what these comments do is put the spotlight back on President Trump and his handling of the coronavirus. Over the past couple of weeks, the president, after the Republican National Convention, was able to kind of put the spotlight on Joe Biden regarding the law and order message campaign. He also put a spotlight on Biden not really doing as much campaign travel. We've seen Biden engage on both of those fronts, and now this brings the spotlight back to Trump himself and his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And this is something that the Biden campaign has been pushing for several months. And it's something that we see in polling that while Trump gets positive grades on the economy most of the time, his handling of the coronavirus gets negative grades. And we see that in key battleground states, especially states that he is visiting. That is something that is contributing to his being behind Joe Biden in this poll. So I think this really refocuses the conversation and this campaign and raises the question of, is this going to be a referendum on Trump Trump's handling of coronavirus. And that's something that those voters that they're trying to attract have to will have to wait and see how they assess that.
And let's bring into the conversation our Ed O'Keefe, CBS News political correspondent, who is there actually in Freeland, Michigan. Ed, tell us what you're hearing from people at that rally with respect to these revelations by Bob Woodward that the president downplayed the threat of the pandemic despite understanding that it was more serious than just the typical flu.
Yeah, it's essentially what you heard from who Adam talked to, that they they think the president's done a perfectly good job and have no reason to be concerned about his comments. And that shouldn't come as a surprise, as Caitlin said. These are his most loyal supporters. They've come from as far away as California in at least one case, according to one of the people that Adam spoke with. Many of these people here, not only fans of the president, but also big critics of this state's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, co-chairman of the Biden campaign, who, of course, has implemented some of the strictest stay-at-home orders in the country. She's been pretty aggressive about it and outspoken about her desire to keep this state as safe as possible, but people here have been critical of her decision to do that. So he'll rally here tonight at the airport. This has become a favorite format of the Trump campaign. Have the president fly in with Air Force One, use it as a backdrop in a partially indoor, partially outdoor setting, a large hangar. And there are cars coming from both directions towards this airport. It's still lining up to be here. We see nothing like this from the Biden campaign. That's mostly because they are trying to avoid hosting large public gatherings where anyone gets sick. I'm not wearing a mask right now because I'm far enough away from our crew and far enough away from people lining up to go in. But if you have 6 people walk by, maybe 1 or 2 wearing a mask, others are not. And we'll see when the event begins later this evening how many people in the crowd might be wearing them. That's the reality that we've seen at Trump events across the country.
It's really interesting, Ed, to just see the atmospherics behind you and to hear as that crowd begins to gather, the contrast, as you note, between what we have seen with President Trump out on the campaign trail and what we've been seeing from Joe Biden. Asma, let me turn to you. In interviews with Woodward, the president also discussed his relationships with various authoritarian leaders like North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin. How did he characterize those relationships?
I was struck specifically, I would say, by a comment that I saw reported out that he referenced the fact that he did not think that President Obama is particularly smart. And in backing up those comments, he cited North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, in saying that he concurred with him in believing that Barack Obama is not particularly intelligent. What struck me, I think, most interestingly about this is, the sense that he is specifically pointing to a couple of authoritarian leaders whom the United States does not have particularly warm diplomatic relationships with, to put it mildly, as backing up his own personal feelings for his predecessor, the Democratic president. And it was just a really unusual choice. But again, I find that many of the things in this book, while surprising and bizarre, to be blunt at times, none of them, I think, strike us as being so strange with some of the, comments that we've heard time and again from the president over the past couple of years, again, is what we heard on the pandemic. And I keep going back to that because I feel that the pandemic was the instance in which the speech that we heard from the public, that we heard from the president publicly repeatedly seemed to suggest that this virus was not going to be that severe compared to what we heard in the Woodward book. And everything else thus far that we've seen, well, I concur some of it is rather strange. It does seem to jive with, more or less the tone we have heard from the president on other comments he's made in the past.
I want to go back to Ed to close it out here. So, Ed, tell us what the Biden campaign has been doing in response to these revelations in Bob Woodward's book. What has been the reaction from the candidate?
We talked about this last night, Elaine, and it bears repeating. This is the second time in less than a week that the Biden campaign had to pivot off of an intended focus on the economy to respond to reports about something the president has said in the past. In this case, the reports from Bob Woodward were released yesterday just as Biden was landing here in Michigan. He responded to them yesterday. He was asked about them in an interview that aired on CNN earlier and sort of gave a similar response that he thinks this is inappropriate. The president has failed to do his job. We saw Kamala Harris talk about this in Miami a little earlier during an event with African-American leaders, essentially reiterating what the Democratic line is at this point. The president failed to keep Americans safe, incredible disregard for public safety and for letting people know how serious this virus is. We've also seen it very quickly put into advertising. Both the Biden campaign and some Democratic super PACs are beginning to air ads in battleground states and digitally to reach people with the audio of this. And one other interesting thing that we've learned, we haven't seen it ourselves here, but the Democratic National Committee tells us that there is a truck with a mobile billboard circling this airport, trying to be seen by Trump supporters as they go in, and that mobile billboard is also airing the audio of what the president told Bob Woodward in those interviews. There's a message on the billboard that says something along the lines of "the president lied and people died." So we'll see that kind of thing probably repeat itself over the course of the next several days as the campaign continues, but shows you very quickly how Democrats stood up to respond to those reports in the wake of the publication yesterday.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Asma Khalid, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.